It's time for us to check back in with Watermelon Hill and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. And if you'd like to buy the book, if you'd like to buy your own copy of the book, please visit watermelonhillbook.com and you'll be able to pick up a copy there. I'll put that link in the description below as well. Laundry Day. In the days before modern washers and dryers, laundry was a major task that still had to be done. It just wasn't done as often as we do today. Mom didn't have the luxury of throwing a load of clothes in the washer and when they finished, just tossing them in the dryer and hanging or folding them when they were dry, so it wasn't something that she could do after supper any night of the week. Mom had to do the laundry on a scrub board, wring the clothes out by hand, rinse them, wring them out again, put them in a basket, and hang them on the clothesline out in the yard. In the winter, it was not unusual for the clothes to freeze on the line before they dried. We would bring them in the house and they would be stiff as boards. If it was raining or snowing, laundry still had to be done, so the clothes had to be hung inside the house to dry. We would have clotheslines strung in every room except the kitchen. In addition to soap and bleach, Mom put blueing in the rinse water for the white clothes to brighten them. Blueing was a blue cake that looked like some sort of wax. She would cut it up into thin shavings so it would dissolve in the hot water. She also put starch in the rinse water for the clothes that would be ironed. There was no such thing as permanent pressed, so almost everything except socks and underwear were ironed. But by the time the clothes dried on the line, it might be the next day before they were done. Mom would have a pan of water handy, so when she put an item on the ironing board, she would just dip her fingers in the water and sprinkle the clothes with it before she ironed them with her cast iron flat irons. She used 2 irons, so while she was using one, the other would be heating on the stove and she would keep switching to a hot one. Even the sheets were starched and ironed. After my sisters moved away from home, I, being the youngest, was the helper on laundry day. We would collect rainwater in barrels by the back porch for laundry. This was much easier than pulling that much water out of the well. When it started raining, we would have the barrels covered up and spouts were arranged to divert the water off the roof out into the yard until the roof was washed clean of leaves and soot from the fireplaces and cook stove. Then we moved the spouts to divert the water into the barrels and filled them up. Mom heated the water on the stove in the big copper boiler that she used for canning. We then put it into the wash and rinse tubs as needed to keep the water the right temperature. The soap did not come in a box from the supermarket, but was lye soap that Mom made herself. It was an all-purpose soap which we also used for dishes, baths, floors, everything that needed cleaning. A scrub board was set in one tub to wash the clothes, then they were wrung out by hand and were transferred to the rinse tub. The first improvement in the laundry situation was the purchase of a hand-operated wringer which stood on the floor and hung over the tub to catch the water. Still a lot of work, but better than wringing by hand. Next, she got a set of 2 connected tubs standing on legs with drains in them where you could connect a hose and run the water outside or just drain it into buckets to carry out. I had to keep the waters changed as needed. Even after Mom got a washer, not much else was changed. It was a wringer washer with a drain where you could attach a garden hose and run the water outside. At least Mom didn't have to scrub and wring the clothes by hand anymore. She still used the set of tubs, but now she could use them both for rinsing, so it was more convenient. After the laundry was finished, I always had to take a bucket of the soapy wash water to the outhouse and scrub the inside with it. Mom believed in keeping everything clean. Cooling it. Even before we had electricity, we had no problem keeping our food cool on the farm, as long as it was winter. Spring and fall were a little harder, and summer was a real problem. Even after we got electricity, it was 3 or 4 years before we got a refrigerator. Before that, we got by the best we could. Down over the hill from the house was an old hand-dug well. It was about 2 or 3 feet in diameter and lined with rocks. We would hang perishables such as milk and butter down the well in a covered bucket. Meat was not a problem, as it was salt cured and would keep and was usually used up by summer anyway. If we had fresh meat, such as chicken or wild meat, it was cooked right away. When we first moved to Watermelon Hill, we didn't even have a cellar near the house. Dad built one in back of the house as soon as possible, but until then, the only cellar was a small one dug into the ground under one end of the barn. We always had a cow or two to provide milk, but without refrigeration, it wouldn't keep more than 2 or 3 days at most, even in the well. The cow provided milk every day, but there was usually a calf that needed most of it. We only got what was left over. I have loved milk all my life, a little surprising considering that most of what I had when I was young was not cold. Well, maybe not so surprising. What we have as babies is warm, isn't it? Our first refrigerator was a wonderful event in our lives. Dad bought it secondhand from Red Caudill, one of our neighbors down the road, in 1948 or 1949. I think it stood less than 5 feet tall, and most of that was not refrigerator. The entire bottom half was only the housing for the motor and compressor. The rest of the space was completely empty. The freezer compartment was approximately 1/2 of a cubic foot. Regardless, we were as excited as if it had been a huge walk-in freezer. We put water in the ice cube trays and anxiously awaited for ice cubes. Talk about a watched pot never boils. This was the direct opposite, but the same principle applies. It took most of a day to freeze some slushy ice cubes in the old metal trays, but I'm sure it would have been sooner if we hadn't been constantly checking on them. The little freezer never got cold enough to keep ice cream, but even so, the refrigerator changed our lives. Milk was cold, we could safely keep leftovers. It was wonderful. In a couple of years, we replaced our first refrigerator with a new one, which was still in use when the farm was sold more than 20 years later. It was larger and more efficient, but could not compare with the luxury we felt when we got our first one. Hog killing time. Hogs were very important to my family on the farm because they were our main source of meat. We had an occasional Sunday chicken or some wild meat, but the hog was what was salt cured and available when needed. I really looked forward to hog killing time. It was the one time of the year when we could have fresh pork. The rest of the year it was cured, or in the case of sausage, fried, then canned just like vegetables. Hog killing time was usually late November when the weather had turned cool. The hog selected for slaughter was killed with a single well-placed .22 caliber bullet to the head and the throat cut right away to drain the blood. There had to be several men helping, as a full-grown fattened hog weighing 400 to 500 pounds is very awkward to handle. The hog was loaded on a sled, which was low to the ground and hauled closer to the house for the butchering process. At the location chosen for the butchering, a fire was already burning. There was a large rock on each side of the fire with a big kettle of boiling water resting between them. The hog was placed on a low, homemade table or just left on the sled, and boiling water poured over it to loosen the hair, which was then scraped off with knives. The hog was then rinsed with more clean water. The skin was left on the meat to be used as seasoning in vegetables, greens, and soup beans. A tripod of poles was set up in a single tree, a wooden bar about 2 feet wide with steel hooks on the ends, used to hook up a horse to a plow, suspended from it. The single tree was hooked between the hog's hind legs, and it was hoisted up with a block and tackle until the head cleared the ground. The hog was then split down the belly and the insides caught in a wash tub. This was not all waste by any means. A favorite saying in the country was, "We used everything but the squeal." We made use of nearly all of the hog except the intestines. Mom never made chitterlings, as a lot of Southern people did, but we didn't waste much else. Of course, the liver and heart were saved, and care was taken that they were kept clean. The head was cut off and sent to the kitchen, where Mom removed the brain, a real delicacy, and the tongue. The rest of the head was cooked and made into sauce, also known as head cheese, flavored with sage and other herbs. After it gelled, the sauce was sliced and made delicious sandwiches. You can buy sauce packaged as lunch meat in the supermarket, but it cannot be compared. Homemade sauce is great, but I don't even like the supermarket version. After the carcass was cleaned and washed out, it was left hanging long enough to cool before it was cut into pieces to be cured. The hams, shoulders, bacon, ribs, and tenderloin were separated, and all the fat was saved to be rendered into lard or used in soap making. Most of the hog was cured by rubbing salt into the meat and laid on shelves in the smokehouse. Hog killing day was busy from daylight until after dark, as well as a day or two afterward, but was also a time of feasting. Most of the meat was cured, but that night we usually had some fresh fried tenderloin. What a treat! We couldn't cure the brain or liver, so we prepared them within the first day or the next at the latest. I know a lot of people don't like liver and think eating brains is downright disgusting, but to us, they were ambrosia. Brains are delicious, scrambled with eggs, or just breaded and fried. They can still be found on the menu at some small country restaurants in the South, but very few. We would cook the tongue and heart right away also. They were all treats to us because they were fresh and not cured. I can remember going back to the stove 2 or 3 times after supper was over and getting yet another piece of liver out of the pot until I was stuffed. Mom pickled the pig's feet and even roasted the tail. I enjoyed them at the time, but I don't know if I could work up the same appetite for them today. The last time I ate pickled pig's feet was in 1965 while I was in the Army. I was in the NCO club at McGregor Missile Range in the desert near White Sands, New Mexico, and had a couple of drinks at the time, but I must admit they still tasted good to me. One of the more traumatic events of my childhood was getting a haircut, believe it or not. Doesn't sound like much, but you never had to endure my dad's clippers. They were not electric, but hand-operated. The cutters worked on the same principle as electric ones do, with 2 blades shuttling back and forth, but were operated by squeezing the handles together. Each time the handles were squeezed, the blades cut, and when they were released, they came back to the starting point. Still doesn't sound too bad, except for being slow, very slow. Did I mention that they had 1 tooth broken? Dad squeezed the handles to make them work, and in the process was wiggling the cutting head a little each time. It was impossible to keep his hand from moving as he was squeezing, and with the broken tooth pulling hair on every cycle of the blades. It seemed to take forever. I think those clippers pulled out about as much hair as they cut. It's a wonder I'm not bald, but I guess the hair grew back. To make matters even worse, this was well before long hair was in. Even if it had been in, it wouldn't have been in with Mom and Dad, so we had to have haircuts regularly. Haircut day was one time that I was a little envious of my sisters. They had just the opposite problem. They weren't allowed to cut their hair. What a relief it was when Dad started taking me with him to town to get my hair cut. I not only got a trip to town, but the haircut was over much faster and less painfully than it was at home. Barber shops not only had barbers, but a shoeshine boy, or more accurately, a shoeshine man, since he was at least as old as Dad. Barber shops and beauty parlors were strictly segregated back then. You never saw a woman in a barber shop, and if a man ever set foot in a beauty parlor, he would have been harassed by his friends for the rest of his days, and people would have expressed serious doubts about his manhood. The barber shop was a place for men to gather to get a haircut while they were waiting their turn, to relax, cuss if they wanted to, swap lies, and tell tall tales. No place for a woman. Dad's favorite barber was John Burton. John was also an avid hunter and an experienced bird dog trainer who came out to the farm to hunt with us 2 or 3 times each season. Since Dad had his favorite barber, I had my choice of all the other barbers in the shop. Of course, there were only one other, so I got him. His name was John Justice. His grandson, Johnny Justice, was in my class at school. I always thought that would be a good name for an old Western hero. Here, riding out of the sunset to right wrongs and catch all the bad guys, comes Johnny Justice, hero of the Old West. Well, Johnny wasn't a Western hero, and neither was his grandpa. He was just a small-town barber, but a pretty good one. He was probably at least 70 at the time and had many years of experience. The only thing that bothered me was after the haircut when he shaved around my ears. He had a little trimmer in his hands. I could feel it when he was cutting my hair with the clippers, but I wasn't worried about them. What I was worried about was that straight razor. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the hand holding the razor moving toward my ear. The trembling in his hand would be magnified in the movement of the razor. As the wagon razor blade came closer and closer, I would try to not move a muscle. I don't think I even breathed. When it finally reached my face, his fingers would rest on my cheek and the razor would touch down light as a feather. He would make the stroke with the razor smoothly and confidently with never a nick. He never cut me. There was just the fear of it. Even though I knew he probably wouldn't cut me, still, every time he came at me with that razor wagging back and forth, I expected an ear to land in my lap. Everything considered, I don't know which was worse, the pain of the pulling hair or the fear of losing my ears. Eventually, of course, I grew up and could choose any barber shop I wanted, but to this day, I get a little nervous when a barber shaves around my ears with a straight razor. Road work. Since we lived at the end of a private road about a quarter of a mile long, constant upkeep was necessary to keep it passable. Most of the base of the road was done by Dad and my older brothers before I got big enough to help much, so I can't take any credit for that. When we bought the farm, the road was in bad shape. In some spots, it seemed that the bottom dropped out every time it rained or when there was a spring thaw. They hauled many wagon loads of rocks which they had picked up from the fields when plowing. They beat them into the road with sledgehammers until finally there was a solid roadbed. After that, Dad had a few loads of gravel hauled every year and it stayed in good shape. Once in a while, we would beat some more rocks into a trouble spot, but for a private road in the hills of Kentucky, it was exceptionally good. My brothers never got paid for their work. It was just expected by Dad and by them that they would do whatever work needed to be done. By the time I was about 12, Dad was having more steady work than in years past, and since I was 8 years younger than my next older brother, I was the only one left at home. I was still expected to do whatever needed to be done, and I did, with no expectation of pay, but once, I guess, Dad decided he would give me a lesson in economics. I'm quite sure he never had a lesson in economics in his life, but he certainly gave me one I will never forget. As a gravel road is used, it gradually packs down in the tracks where the tires run, leaving the edges and the middle higher. Eventually, a car will start scraping as it goes over the middle, and you have to drive closer to the side of the road to clear the middle. Our road was narrow to begin with, so there wasn't much room to spare without running into the ditch. Our road had reached this point, so the middle and sides of the road needed to be dug down and filled into the tire paths to even the road up again. The ditches also needed to be dug out and cleaned up to run water off so it wouldn't wash the road out. Like I said, I expected to do whatever work I was told to do on the farm, so I was very surprised when Dad told me he had a paying job for me if I wanted it. Did I want it? Of course I wanted it. I was only 12 and did not get an allowance, so any offer of a paying job was more than welcome. Dad told me he would give me $10 to even the road out and clean the ditches. I thought it was a fortune. I actually remember telling Dad that he didn't have to pay me that much. I was not much of a businessman and had not learned how to estimate jobs at that time. Dad said, "Son, you'll earn every penny of it." Truer words were never spoken. Keep in mind that this was a rock and gravel road packed down by years of traffic. This is not a road that can be dug with a shovel. Each day I would go to my road work carrying a pick, a mattock, a shovel, and a jug of water. I needed all of them. The high sides and middle had to be dug down with the pick or mattock. The shovel was just used to distribute the gravel after it had been broken apart. It was almost like busting concrete every inch of the way. The ditches had to be reformed as I went along, and shallow ditches cut diagonally across the road in steep areas to divert the water from the road into the ditch on the roadside. Actually, I had to build the tire paths up above the road surface so they would be level when they were packed down again. My hands were already reasonably tough from the normal chores on a farm, but I soon developed a fine set of blisters and sore muscles I didn't even know I had before. I don't remember exactly how long the job took, but my hands were healed up by the time it was done, and my sore muscles were mostly gone. It was at least a week of all-day work every day to earn my $10. I made less than my dad made during the Depression working on the roads for the WPA. You may think I should have been disappointed that Dad paid me so little for such hard work, but I hadn't expected to be paid at all. $10 was a lot of money for me at the age of 12, and I got a little insight into how hard Dad had to work back in the 30s to earn what little he was paid by the WPA to support a family with. It was a lesson in economics I will never forget. The lessons that are hardest seem to stick with you the longest. We'll stop right there for today. This last little part that Dale was telling us about the road work, I can relate to that. Not that I've ever worked on a road with a mattock and a shovel, but we have our road, we have to maintain it. It's not a state road. The state road is, you turn off the state road, so of course I don't have to maintain that, but where the pavement ends from it, and then it comes by Paul's house out to Steve's house, and our driveway comes off of that, so it has to be maintained. Ours is Steve and Paul's is flat, a flat shot, and since ours is steep, ours, it's a lot to maintain over the years. Matt can scrape it and stuff himself if he has the right equipment. He does now. He uses a little four-wheeler that's got, his four-wheeler's got a scrape blade on it so he can use it. And then anytime, if it gets really bad, we either have to hire somebody, or like recently Paul rented a machine so that he could dig out a ditch down at his house. So while he had it here, Matt worked on our driveway. So sometimes we can do things like that. We're very fortunate that Matt can run machines like that, and very fortunate that we have the machines today, not like in Dale's day where you had to do it all by hand. Since I grew up in a home that also had a driveway like that with Pap and Granny, and it always had to be maintained, we don't even really think about that. It is odd for me to think, well, there's lots of people that's never had to maintain it, because if you live on right off the main road, or you live in a suburb or something, it's all kind of done for you. So I've never even really give that much thought, but it is just a fact of life for us, like it was for Dale. I love that his dad, he says, taught him a lesson in economics. He did. He was really anxious to get that $10, but boy, he had to work for it. He had to work hard for it. I like that. One of my friends, the other day we were talking, her son is, I think he's just a year behind Corey and Katie, but about the same age, went to the same school, and she was talking about him, and speaking of heavy equipment, that's what he does, and she was talking about how well he had done for himself, and how her and her husband was so proud of him, and he just kind of built this business all on his own, and he's Corey and Katie's age, as I said, about maybe a year younger, but their age. And she was explaining how he would buy a piece of equipment and make sure it was paid off totally, and then before he ever bought another one, he just had done that a little bit at a time, is how he'd kind of amassed his equipment that he runs his business with, which is wonderful. But she reminded me of something I just forgot about. There's a teacher at Martins Creek School, still there today, Mr. Sellers, and he had her son, but he had Corey and Katie too. And at that time, I'm not sure if he still does this, but at that time I believe they were in 5th grade when they had Mr. Sellers for Corey and Katie and her son. But he would do this elaborate thing of jobs, and he had a list, and it was everything you think of, like even when you had to go to gym, it was even somebody carrying the shoes, like they had gym shoes, so you had to carry the different shoes to wear. Something, emptying the trash, wiping off the board, just all kinds of, he had just really made it, really thought it out. And they had all these jobs. Of course, there was no real money. He wasn't really paying them, but it was this whole system, this of teaching them. And if you earned, you had to earn so much, and if you didn't earn, how, all these different consequences. And it was just fascinating. And it taught them a lot, and they all got serious about it, and they all, really, of course, some jobs paid more than others, so that you could try to get those jobs if you did good, and it was just this whole elaborate thing. And I'd kind of forgot about it, and then she was telling me, she said, I think that's what really, got him to thinking about stuff like that. And I said, well, I've never thought about it, but I've always said Corey and Katie both are way better with money than me and Matt were when we were their age. And I said, I've not thought about it, but maybe I need to give Mr. Sellers the credit for them too. Maybe that was what impressed them. So they weren't doing that hard labor that Dale was, but that is a wonderful thing for children to learn about work, and about, responsibility, and the consequences if you don't work, and all those kind of things. So I really, really enjoyed that part of Dale's story, and kind of could relate to the road, but definitely, of course, not to doing that back-breaking labor. And talking about back-breaking labor, that the part that how Dale started this, or the part we read today, how it started. Of course, it's not the start of the book. Talking about the laundry that his mother had to do. Can you just imagine? Makes me so thankful. I can, like Dale was saying, I really can. Even if it's 8 o'clock at night, put in a wash and let it wash, and then throw it in the dryer before I go to bed. I can do it that quickly. I'm very thankful for my washer and my dryer. I just can't imagine all that back-breaking labor. And, they, too, another thing that makes it worse in those days is that they actually all did physical labor. So they got dirty, more than we do. Now, I get dirty out in the yard. Matt gets dirty pretty much every day at work. But if I'm not working outside, I don't even really need to wash my clothes unless I spill something on them. I might wear the same pair of pants for 3 or 4 days because I'm not really doing anything in them. So, but in those days, they did. So they would have gotten dirty and needed to be washed, And like he was saying, winter, summer, whatever, it still had to be done. They still had to wash their clothes. And my goodness, what I just can't even imagine the burden that would have been. Of course, they didn't know his mother didn't know any better, and Dale didn't either. Then they didn't know didn't have anything to compare it to. But you can see, when Dale's kind of describing how it changed, when she first got where it would wring out the clothes, that had to be just, wow, this has made this so much easier. And then when she got the 2 tubs, every step, you just know that her workload was just lightened, and it had to be so much easier. I can remember there being an old washing machine. Maybe it would have been one of those like Dale's describing, that was kind of open and had the drain, but the drain was probably stopped up. But it was behind Granny Gazzy's house, back behind it, and it would fill with water. It was just left back there, and I liked to play in that water when I was little. But you can just see, and you can imagine those conveniences, how much better, how much easier her workload got. And not just Dale's mother, but everybody's, as washing machines and dryers got like they are today. And then today, I prefer the old style, but they have them that you can even like program, and it's like a whole computer on it. You can do all kinds of stuff too. So, just amazing to think of the changes since then. Now the part about ironing, again, changing. Like he was saying, today we can buy clothes. I try to buy clothes that I never have to iron because I don't like to iron. It's not that I don't like to iron. I don't like to get my ironing board out. Is that terrible? But I don't. I have to put it in my closet, so it's awkward to get it out. I don't like to, if it was just always out all the time, I wouldn't mind to iron. So what I end up doing, like yesterday when I was going to iron something I was going to put on for church, I ironed it on my bed. I don't want to get out the ironing board. It's just too much of a hassle to drag it out. So I ironed it on my bed. But the part he was talking about her changing out the heated irons, that's, again, amazing. I just had to plug mine in yesterday and iron. But I like the part about her sprinkling the clothes. I have this, about had a little bird here. I don't think there's a nest up here, but about flew onto my head. Maybe startled that I was here. Turned around and went back to where it come from. Anyway, I could have this memory of my Mama Marie ironing in her little living room, and she used a Coke bottle. It's just like an old RC Coke bottle or something like that, and it was a stopper that went in the top of it, and it sprinkled out, so she sprinkled, and sometimes she would let me do that. Now, somehow after she passed away, Granny ended up with that little stopper, so I have it. I have it in mine and Matt's bathroom. It's just such a treasure because I remember Mama Marie using it. It's beat up, and probably because us kids played with it and kind of bent, but by that time she would have not been using the heated irons like Dale's mother. She would have been using one that was plugged in too, but she was still using the sprinkler though. So that's one of my favorite memories from Mama Marie. And then the rainwater, catching all the rainwater, that was another thing. How wise and smart, and I'm sure other people did that too, but how wise Dale's family were to gather that water that way instead of having to get it out of the creek or pull it up out of the well. And I love the ingenuity of that. First, they put the drains, diverted it outside just into the yard, because that first water would have all been dirty. I don't even know if I would have thought of that. Of course, there's dust and birds and all that, like he said. And in those days, and would be on my house too in the winter, soot from fires. So how brilliant is that they basically let the rain wash off the roof, then gathered the water. So I really loved that part. I had a rain barrel for many years. Matt built me just in the backyard from an old, I don't even know where he got it, somewhere down in Georgia. They used to use them for water barrels down there because they didn't have any, when they camped outside deer hunting, didn't have any running water. Anyway, I had it for many, many years, and we used it a lot. But it finally come apart, and we've not been able to replace it yet. We've actually bought another barrel, but we've just not got it replaced. And Matt, one of the reasons is Matt was trying to figure out a way to put it somewhere else besides where it was at. So it's just sitting in my yard now, but I hope to get it fixed again. One other thing, I bet a lot of you remember, just like what Dale was talking about, when they got the first refrigerator. Of course, I've always had one, so I don't remember anything about that part. But I remember those metal ice trays. That's what we always had growing up, what Granny had. I wonder if there's any down at her house somewhere stuck in a cabinet. But that's what we used, and you'd use the little lever to loosen it and pop them all out. I bet a lot of you remember those ice trays too. And then the hog killing. I've never been part of a hog killing, but Pap's told me some of the same stories that Dale shared, just about what an exciting time that was, and a feast. That's what Pap would say. That was feasting time, because for the same reasons that Dale shared, they got to eat that fresh meat instead of eating cured meat. So I wish me and Matt had a place to have hogs, and we could do that ourselves, but we don't. Where we live, we don't have a place like that. Maybe someday, but not today. We don't. I wish we did, though. That would be really rewarding to raise we raise a lot of the food we eat as far as vegetables go, but it would be wonderful to be able to raise our own meat too. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was the haircut. Oh my goodness, Dale had a time, didn't he? His daddy was pulling the hairs out, and then he was afraid of the straight razor. I'd be afraid of the straight razor too, I think, especially if somebody's hand was shaky. The first haircut Corey and Katie got, and which I think this is pretty common for kids, the very first one that I had that cut their hair was Miss Cindy. She just cut it here at home, and they didn't like it. They cried. And then it was, mostly what we did was cut their bangs, and the rest just kind of grew down. But then the first time I actually took them to somewhere to get their hair kind of shaped up and shaped the back of it, to a gentleman in Andrews that cut my hair at the time, they sobbed. Both of them sobbed. They didn't try to get away, and they didn't try to fight him or anything, but they just sat there with just just bawling. And it wasn't that they didn't want their hair cut. They were afraid of him. They were afraid of being in a strange place, but I can remember their little faces, especially Katie's. They did not like it. They didn't like it. They was upset by it. But after that, I don't remember them ever crying after that. And he cut their hair for a long time, so even like, you know, 3 or 4 years later, then they were actually wanting him to cut it and get a cute haircut and all that. So funny though with kids. But poor Dale having to get his pulled out and then being afraid of the razor. It's funny and interesting to hear other people's experiences like that about haircuts, because that's just something we take for granted. We don't even think about it, you know. We don't even think about it. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. I hope, as always, you'll leave me a comment and tell me what jumped out at you. And please do drop back by next Friday so we can see what happens next in Dale's life here in Watermelon Hill.